resume the recording. So from now on, the meeting's being recorded. I mean, that will matter once we officially start in a couple minutes, but to those who are here so far, welcome. I'm Josh Gold with the CIC Toronto. We have a few other CIC Toronto executives with us at the moment, and we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes.
So I don't see anybody, Josh, right?
Okay, well, you should, I think, because I made you a co-host. So I have it on the right-hand side, or maybe if you click on the bottom at participants.
Okay.
But it might just be a me thing. I'll allow Michael to talk because he is always very knowledgeable about these things. So hopefully I didn't put him on the spot.
Hi. Yeah, so you're having trouble seeing the participants?
Yeah, I've gone to gallery. I'm in gallery actually. And I mean, I don't care. I don't have to see the participants. It's not,
Oh,
hi,
well,
Michael, by the way.
Any of them in that sense, because
Yeah.
they're not allowed to yet unless I allow them, which I think, what do you think, Michael? I'll just allow everyone and we can all kind of see each other.
Yeah, sounds good. Can you see me now, John?
You got your video's not on.
Okay, I see. I don't have an option to turn it on here, actually.
So maybe we can only talk, but not video. I'm just a warning to everyone. I'm allowing everyone to talk if you would like to. You do not need to talk, but you are welcome to talk. We want this call to be slightly more intimate and very open to questions, as I will introduce shortly. I think we'll start at 5 minutes past the hour because we still have a few folks trickling in.
Halfway to U of T time.
Yeah. Great. And anyone now that I've been allowing people to talk, anyone can feel free to make small talk. Otherwise, questions, we will have ample time for questions. Once again, I'm Josh Gold with the CIC Toronto and just wanted to welcome everyone. In the government, they're all anti-Zoom, so we're stuck with WebEx or Microsoft Teams, with the latter being far superior to to WebEx, but it's always a pleasure to use Zoom.
Yeah.
A lot simpler. Okay, so I think it looks like the trickle has slowed, and as they come in, I will continue to allow them to talk if they would so desire. But for now, I think we may as well start with my boring intro spiel. But so to everyone, first of all, this is being recorded, so I've given you all the power to talk, but just know that if you do talk, this will be recorded. And I don't think we usually post these anywhere, but I suppose that's possible given the recording. But welcome to this evening's event. I'm Josh Gold, Vice President of the CIC Toronto branch, and I'm filling in for our excellent president, Anthony Alukwe, who couldn't be here at the moment, unfortunately. But I'll just start with our usual pitch of what is the CIC to any newcomers. I think I'm looking at the audience names. A lot of you are in our CIC family, but the Canadian International Council is a platform for citizens to engage in discussions on international issues. And our mission is to be an independent, nonpartisan, and charitable membership organization that will involve Canadians in defining our country's place in the world. So we convene events across Canada that inform and engage a wide range of actors. We do rigorous research, rigorous being the adjective that is in my speaking notes, but it is, we do have quite a wide range of research. We provide ongoing analysis and a diverse array of viewpoints on current world events, and especially Canadian foreign policy and foreign policy decisions. We publish the International Journal, and as well as Behind the Headlines, and we have a blog on our website as well. And I'm just going to mute those talking. Just to be clear, I've allowed everyone who participates to speak, but I will be muting you until there's a time for questions. But as I was saying, Canadian International Council, we do all sorts of research, events, and also we offer all sorts of learning and professional development opportunities, and as well as networking and engagement opportunities, whether you're at a younger stage of your career or more professional stage. Usually our in-person events feature wine and cheese and certain goodies like that. So we look forward to welcoming you all in person once those kind of events can resume. We have 18 branches now across the country in terms of the CIC, in all sorts of cities across 7 provinces, which gives us a presence in local communities that's unparalleled really in Canadian global affairs. And I'll just finish these opening bits with the kind of news that the Canadian International Council has recently conducted a major deliberative democracy exercise wherein we polled and sampled 444 Canadians who we brought together on different weekends and different evenings, of course, virtually, to discuss foreign policy issues with a scientific method developed by Stanford. And this was kind of a year of research that went into the making of this, a very big project. And results of this are going to come out soon. There will be media attention given. So stay tuned for the results of this, what's really an unprecedented exercise in deliberative democracy that the CIC has conducted in the lead up to, or sort of as part of its goals in its broader global ambition and growth strategy. But all right, I will now introduce our speaker for tonight. I am just the moderator and the person who pitches CIC and encourages you all to join and become a member. But our speaker today, this evening, Jon Allen, requires little introduction in our circles. He's a very regular face among our CIC community and of course among the broader foreign policy community. But Jon Allen has had a distinguished career in the Canadian Foreign Service. In addition to postings abroad in Mexico City and New Delhi and Washington, D.C., he spent his early career in the Legal Bureau where he represented Canada in disputes under the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and worked in the areas of human rights, humanitarian, and environmental law. From 2006 to 2010, he was Canada's ambassador to Israel, which will be particularly topical in some of the themes that come up today. And from 2012 to 2016, he was our ambassador to Spain and Andorra, and was also Chargé d'Affaires to the Holy See from December 2012 to July 2014. He's currently a senior fellow at the CIC and also a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And he's a regular commentator on sort of current affairs in Israel-Palestine recently in particular. I really recommend, and I'll post this in the chat shortly, but Jon's written a great article in the Globe and Mail on the Israel-Palestine conflict that I recommend. So with that said, Jon will be speaking to us as advertised on the Biden administration's foreign policy challenges, and he'll touch on perhaps some of the January 6th events that kind of shook a lot of our attitudes toward the US, or what we thought of it, how it affected other countries' perceptions of the US. And I'm sure other issues, as I mentioned, including Israel-Palestine, will come up. Our objective is that this is an intimate conversation. I've given all those who have joined the permission to talk. So please do feel free to ask questions. You can write those in the chat or in the Q&A feature, or even not too disruptively, even just say something if there's a lull in the conversation. So I think with that said, Jon, on to you. And we're all really looking forward to this.
Thanks very much, Josh. And thanks to CIC Toronto and Michael Chen, who got this thing going. And I'm always honored to chat with CIC and my branch, the Toronto branch. So the following is in part based on my 5 years dealing with Canada-US relations at what was then Foreign Affairs, first as the DG for North America, and then, as Josh suggested, as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas, and on my 6 years over 2 different administrations serving at our embassy in Washington. But it's also influenced in part by my time in Europe, where I was able to see America and hear Europeans speak about the US from a bit of a greater distance. As Josh suggested, any analysis of this subject can't avoid a brief discussion of the events that took place in Washington on January 6th. Donald Trump's 4 years in office and what they mean for the US and its allies. As this talk isn't meant to be about Canada-US relations, my references to it will be brief, but we can talk about those kinds of issues and any others you want to talk about in the Q&A. The focus will be on the challenges that the Biden administration is facing domestically and in foreign policy terms, including how the US will try to regain its place as a leader within the liberal international order. So while the events in Washington on January 6th were frightening to observe, they were in some ways an expected climax to an illiberal, sometimes illegal, and increasingly destructive Donald Trump presidency. Those who have argued that Trump's failure to accept the election results, his incitement on January 6th, and the actions of his supporters in breaching the Capitol were precisely what can happen when an authoritarian narcissist is elected president, and when the right-wing media and senior members of his party refuse to rein him in, were absolutely correct. And there is no question, calls for the need for unity at the time notwithstanding, he should have been impeached and convicted for his actions. However, the suggestion by many in Congress and the media that these actions have significantly damaged America's reputation abroad seriously misreads how America's allies and enemies alike have viewed the country for years. That reputation has been in significant disrepute since Donald Trump became the Republican Party's nominee, and certainly since he was elected. But long before that, Europeans and other allies of the US were having a hard time respecting a country that is by most markers the richest in the world, and yet has neither universal health care coverage nor affordable higher education. A country that stands by while tens of thousands of its citizens and thousands of its children die annually because it is unable to pass even the most minimum gun control legislation. And a country that, despite a civil war and much lauded civil rights legislation, continues to systematically discriminate against Black Americans and refuses to even admit, never mind atone, for their past and current treatment. To quote the Irish Times journalist Fintan O'Toole, while America has for centuries inspired love and hatred, hope and fear, envy and contempt, and awe and anger, there is one emotion that has never been directed towards the US until now, and that's pity. 4 months after Joe Biden was elected president, America's allies continue to observe what's happening in Congress and in the country and wonder whether 2024 might see a repeat of 2016. Could 70% of Republicans really believe that Donald Trump won the last election? Could Liz Cheney really be removed from her senior position in the party because she refused to pledge allegiance to the ex-president? Will Republicans succeed in restricting voters in a blatant effort to swing the next election in their favor? The first time I served in Washington, from 1997 to 2001, Bill Clinton was the president in his second term. The scandal then, of course, was his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, not quite on par with instigating a riot on Capitol Hill or conditioning aid to a foreign country on that country's implicating a presidential candidate in a crime. Our then Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, and Clinton had a warm relationship. They golfed together, talked regularly on the phone, and Clinton flew to Quebec City just prior to Quebec's second referendum to support his friend and speak virtually off the cuff in favor of a united Canada. The relationship never went public, of course, because a Canadian Prime Minister can never be seen to be close to a US president. At the end of my 4 years there, we witnessed the Bush versus Gore hanging Chads battle for the presidency. It was nasty, all right, but it was resolved a lot more civilly and with a lot more grace than what the world recently witnessed in Washington. Overall, the Clinton administration did a reasonable job of balancing the US's interests and its values. It ended a war in the Balkans, tried hard to bring peace to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and acknowledged its failure to respond to the genocide in Rwanda. I returned to Washington in 2004 under Bush 43. This was post 9/11 and after Canada had refused to join the US in Iraq. Those were the days when you were either with the US or against it, and Canada was firmly in the again camp. We were treated not as trusted allies and the US's most important trading partner, but rather as second-class citizens. I witnessed then a more frightened and much uglier America, one that became defined by its unjustified war in Iraq, its prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and the Abu Ghraib tortures. The overarching view then in Washington, and especially at the White House and the Pentagon, was one where anti-terrorism trumped the rule of law every time. Despite these flaws and its checkered past, it was still possible to be more optimistic about the US and its role in the world. At the time, I remember telling Canadian audiences visiting Washington, audiences who generally didn't have much time for George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, or Don Rumsfeld, that at least 50% of Americans were Democrats, and that many of them were more liberal than many Canadians. Indeed, there always have been two Americas. One was the good America that wanted to spread liberalism and capitalism around the world while benefiting itself and supporting its allies. It was an America that considered itself exceptional. On the one hand, it believed that it had things to teach the world, like the value of free elections and a free press, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. On the other hand, it was exceptional because the rules-based order, international law, and multilateral treaties only applied to the US when it wanted them to. Yes, America supported the United Nations, but only as long as it retained a veto in the Security Council. Yes, it supported the abolition of landmines and was the campaign's largest funder, but it wouldn't join the anti-landmines treaty because the Pentagon didn't want its hands tied. Yes, the International Criminal Court was a key tool in the global fight against genocide and crimes against humanity, and the US was initially supportive of its establishment, but it ultimately refused to join unless it could prevent the court's reach to American soldiers abroad. During some periods immediately following World War II and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, the US played a very positive role. Its successes included supporting the UN system writ large, Bretton Woods, NATO, the IMF, and the World Bank. It helped to rebuild Japan and Germany with the Marshall Plan and supported the creation of a united Europe. And when the wall fell, it supported the countries of the former Soviet Union in their efforts to join NATO and the EU. However, in sharp contrast to the myth of America as the city upon a hill and beacon of hope, there's always been a different America, one that most American politicians and diplomats that I used to run into choose to ignore when they are extolling their country's virtues. This is an America that tried to convince the world that there was a difference in quality between authoritarians, for example, General Pinochet in Chile, whom they supported, and totalitarians like Fidel Castro in Cuba, who they opposed. An America that engineered or supported coups and attempted coups in places like Guatemala, Iran, Chile, and Cuba. A country that propped up illegitimate military regimes in Argentina, Brazil, and South Vietnam, and an America that invaded Iraq on false premises and lit a fire there that spawned hundreds of thousands of deaths, the expansion of ISIS's role, and an empowered Iran. And what about Canada's place in the US's worldview? Well, we, of course, have a lucky neighbor, the other North American partner in NATO and the junior member in the G7. We are protected militarily by the US and benefit massively by having her as our most important trading and investment partner. These are enormous advantages, and few countries are as lucky as we are to have such a neighbor. But having the US as a neighbor also has its drawbacks. It's far too easy to have an English-speaking big brother with a market of 350 or so million people on your border. We have entered into multiple trade agreements with Europe, Latin America, and Asia, all in an effort to diversify our trade. Yet our businessmen and women generally don't take advantage of them. We still do approximately 75% of our trade in goods with the US, the same percentage as when I first served in Washington in 1997. In addition, our innovation and joint venture ecosystems are smaller and less energetic than they should be. We lag behind some other similar-sized economies in entrepreneurship and productivity. We have more trade barriers within Canada than with the US, and too often we follow the US in a race to the bottom, in lowering taxes, in deregulating our economy, and in failing to deal with tax evasion and money laundering. So with that past and more recent history as a backdrop, what domestic and foreign policy challenges is Joe Biden facing going forward? While attacking COVID and jump-starting the economy are enormous challenges, and climate change, cyber threats, and immigration are not far behind, the president highlighted his most difficult domestic challenge during his inauguration: addressing the gaping polarization that currently infects the United States and restoring the truth as the basis for an ongoing conversation with Americans. Needless to say, with approximately 74 million Americans voting for Donald Trump last November and significant numbers still supporting him, the task of returning America to some semblance of bipartisanship and common sense remains a major challenge. Biden's success in pushing through, without a single Republican vote, his $1.9 trillion recovery legislation was important. He has met and far exceeded his COVID targets. It seems unlikely that he will be able to attract sufficient Republican support for his full $1.3 trillion infrastructure package. The GOP has apparently just come back with a response of a package of just under $1 trillion. If they can't compromise, he will have to again take the budget reconciliation route, which can be achieved with a simple majority in the Senate. The GOP also seems intent on scuttling his proposed hike in corporate and personal taxes that Biden hoped to partially fund his infrastructure bill with. Biden deserves credit for his climate plan, which now goes further and faster than Canada's. As with many of his new policies, he has tied his goals to the new jobs, the new infrastructure, and the innovation that he claims will result from them. He's also rolled back most of his predecessors' worst efforts at deregulation in the areas of the environment, including, of course, canceling KXL and the permits to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. Both of those issues were longtime features of Canadian embassy advocacy for KXL on the one hand and against ANWR on the other. Turning to the foreign policy front, it will take time for the president to address the many issues and efforts to tie Biden's hands that his predecessor left behind. During his 4 years in office, Donald Trump undercut America's influence by abdicating US global leadership, marginalizing international institutions, and adopting a cynical and highly transactional approach to global affairs. He, of course, abandoned the Iran nuclear deal and failed to secure a better one. He failed to limit North Korea's nuclear program, negotiate arms control with Russia, or contain China's economic and territorial ambitions. He exacerbated US relations with Latin America by imposing bruising sanctions on Cuba, clumsily sanctioning Venezuela, befriending a fellow populist and COVID denier, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and largely ignoring the rest of the continent. He disparaged Africa and befriended authoritarians and dictators in Asia. Joe Biden grabbed some early and easy foreign policy wins by rejoining the WHO and the Paris Climate Agreement. He likely will remove the Trump-imposed obstacles at the WTO if that organization can get its own act together. And he has overhauled his National Security Council by establishing new senior positions on global health, not surprising, democracy and human rights, welcomed, and cyber and emerging technologies, all signaling a sweeping shift in priorities from his predecessor. Human rights and democracy promotion are once again US administration priorities, although achieving success in those areas certainly won't be easy. While patching up with allies in Europe, Japan, and Australia won't be hard in the first instance, real trust in America likely will be wanting initially and will have to be earned over time. After all, former allies have just witnessed dramatic and unsettling shifts in policy approaches from Clinton to Bush to Obama and then Trump. Who can they trust and for how long? It was wrong and a bit tone deaf for Joe Biden to say while introducing his foreign policy team that the US was back and that the US will again take its place at the head of the table. First, good luck, and I hope he does a better job than Justin Trudeau did on being back. Second, and for a whole host of reasons, it might be better if that table that Biden was referring to was round unless and until the US proves that it has the moral and political authority and the staying power to justify being at its head again. Of course, America has been welcomed back into the fold by NATO members who Trump regularly dissed for not fulfilling their financial obligations. There were visible signs of relief on the part of leaders to have a multilateralist and proud climate fighter in the chair at the US-initiated 40-state climate conference. The month of June will allow Biden to further flesh out his foreign policy stances at 3 back-to-back summits, the G7, NATO, and a US-EU get-together. Biden has also made clear that the era of Trump acquiescence to Vladimir Putin's Russia is over, despite agreeing to meet Putin in Geneva in June. After the two agreed to extend the New START arms control treaty, the president turned his critical attention to one of the most devastating hacks in US history and to Russia's interference in the last 2 US elections. He agreed with a journalist's characterization of Putin as a, quote, killer, unquote, and then imposed the most extensive sanctions on Russia since Putin invaded Crimea. China is, of course, a significantly greater challenge. Under its leader for life, Xi Jinping, China is contesting various aspects of the liberal international order. It continues to expand its economic reach and political alliances via its Belt and Road Initiative by investing billions in infrastructure projects in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, sometimes under quite questionable financial arrangements. And its aggressive activities in Hong Kong, the South China Sea, and a significantly harsher tone vis-a-vis Taiwan are all sending shockwaves throughout that region and frankly beyond. On the trade and economic front, China has created the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, signed by 5 nations across the Asia-Pacific region. It's created the New Development Bank and the China-run Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. At the UN, China, Russia, and other authoritarian states have been promoting new norms that privilege national sovereignty over individual rights. Meanwhile, in Xinjiang, China is committing human rights abuses on a wide scale and quashing any and all dissent. The Biden's approach to China will have to be multidimensional. On issues such as climate change and non-proliferation, the US and its allies will want to cooperate with China if it can. Other issues, including Taiwan and the South China Sea, will require, obviously, a more aggressive stance. And in protesting China's unfair trade practices or dealing with its treatment of Uyghur populations, the US should join with others in coalition of the willing. Biden, Blinken, and the senior official at state, Kurt Campbell, responsible for Asia, have all made it clear that they see China as a competitor. The US doesn't want conflict or another Cold War, but it does intend not to be bullied or to cede strategic space to China. Turning to the Middle East, the US and Iran have re-engaged via European intermediaries in an effort to return to the Iran nuclear deal. Biden's under pressure to somehow include restrictions on Iranian ballistic missiles capabilities and its support for terrorism as part of any new deal. This won't happen, but a commitment to another set of negotiations on these issues might be enough to clinch a deal. There is pressure to move quickly, given the upcoming elections in Iran, that will result in a more conservative set of Iranian interlocutors, given the list of hardline candidates that was recently announced. Despite the Biden's team's efforts to downplay its activities in the rest of the Middle East, he waited 4 weeks to call both Bibi Netanyahu and the King of Saudi Arabia, and still hasn't announced candidates for the US ambassador to Israel or its Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East position. The Israel-Palestine conflict has once again reared its ugly and destructive head. Secretary of State Blinken is in the region as we speak. I understand there is some interest in my briefly discussing the most recent conflict between Hamas and Israel separately. So we can do that later, but I'm not going to say more about this issue right now. On Afghanistan, Biden has kept his campaign promise to withdraw US troops. This is, of course, a no-win situation, as it has been for the British, the Russian, and now the US and NATO. Despite the dangers of a return to Taliban control and repression, Biden has advocated American withdrawal for some time, and he's now in charge and able to make it happen. Finally, Biden will be governed in his actions, both domestically and abroad, by the realization that the unbridled globalization and deregulated capitalism of the past 3 decades is no longer a viable option. Indeed, he and his foreign policy team have made it clear that his will be a foreign policy for the middle class, one that is sustainable and that benefits Americans. To the extent that such a shift means more Buy America and more free trade disputes, recent trade actions on Canadian dairy and lumber as an example, we may get caught in the crossfire of this policy. On this front, the questions for the future are first, whether Biden will ultimately be viewed as a 21st century Franklin Roosevelt, who fundamentally changed the course of American society for the better, or as a Barack Obama 2.0, a president with great intentions but limited successes in transforming his country. And second, whether on the foreign policy front, he can earn a seat at the table, hold China and Russia in check, and begin to turn the tide against the authoritarian and populist wave that flowered and was encouraged under his authoritarian and populist predecessor. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take some questions on this and on any other subject that people are interested in. Thanks very much. Thanks again to the CIC.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak, Jon. And I've been told by Michael Chen of the CIC Toronto executive, who actually was one of the key people in organizing this very event, that I can provide the option of having video. So I'm now just turning this over to our audience. I suspect there will be a couple of questions. Please raise your hand or write your question into the chat or the Q&A, or send me a message or anything. I'm happy to enable video, but conscious of people perhaps not expecting that, I won't just do it inadvertently to everyone. So I'll start with two hands I see raised. I think Don was first. Don, go ahead. If you can unmute yourself, which I think you should be able to. Let's see. Don, can you turn yourself off mute? What if I ask you to unmute?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can hear you now, Don.
Okie doke. Jon, I was in the US section of the American division in 1956. And believe it or not, we were having trouble then with Michigan and Chicago. And our whole division was called the Water Power Division, because we were engulfed with the Columbia River, the St. Lawrence, the Chicago diversion, and a bridge between Windsor and Detroit. But it seems to me a big test of Biden in terms of Canadian bilateral issues is line 3. Could you give us your sense of whether Biden is likely to help us in that regard?
Well, it's a tough one for Biden. You know that the governor of Michigan has been a huge and one of the first supporters for Joe Biden. And I believe she's continuing to fundraise and speak on his behalf. So on that sort of personal political level, it probably won't be easy. We also haven't seen Biden step up to the plate too much on the vaccine side. We did get a first series of doses. I don't know whether we'll get more or whether, frankly, we need more. And of course, he did cancel KXL. That was to be expected. It was in his campaign, and he was following on Obama's cancellation during that administration. On the other hand, line 3 is certainly, according to Canada, governed by an international treaty. And if he wants to help Canada, he could follow that line and simply make the argument that the issue is bigger than just the pipeline company and Michigan and there are more important and bigger issues at play. But I can't tell. I'm pretty sure that that Biden and Justin Trudeau have a good relationship. Biden, you'll recall, actually came here just as the Obama administration was ending. One of his last acts, welcomed by Trudeau. They're all on the same page on a lot of issues, but trade is one that will continue to cause problems, not irreparable ones, and not ones that are going to do that much damage. But and the environment, well, most of the issues that you had to deal with have been solved, thank God, and we dealt with others like acid rain. But these are new issues coming up at a time when all things green are coming to the fore, and pipeline companies and oil companies, as we just saw in the lawsuits being won in Holland by environmental groups, they're going to have to do a lot to assure people that that going forward they're able to protect the environment.
Thanks, Don. Did that answer your question? Do you have any follow-ups, or shall we move on?
Well, it still will be a test, I think.
It certainly will.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Let's move on to Monte. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me commend you on an exegetical tour de force in terms of your perspective that you have painted. Erudite, insightful, and I am totally compelled in terms of what you were saying. I would just like to push you on one point in seeking your reflection grounded in your judgment. You inferred or made or intimated that Trump, in a sense, knee-jerkism in terms of whether the United States can be trusted in matters international, whether it be in defense, supporting democracy or NATO or various agreements, that it may well be on an ongoing basis contingent on whoever occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, which I believe may have repercussions long-term in terms of how other agents conduct themselves in their nation states, or intersectionists in terms of what they wish to do in roiling the status quo. If you have any thoughts on this, I would appreciate it. And thank you.
Thanks. And thanks for your comments. I think the Europeans remain somewhat wary, to be honest. First of all, they had to deal with Trump and all that meant, and we know that. We saw it playing out at the G7, at NATO, etc. And now they're dealing with a president who really does, in many ways, have to focus on the domestic agenda. He's got to try and win, at least on his coattails, as many Senate and House seats in less than 2 years. And he or his vice president have got to try and win a re-election in less than 4 years. Healing America, making sure the economy stays upright and moving forward have got to be his key priorities. You know, any American administration can't ignore what's going on, and the Middle East is the perfect example of that, with Blinken and his whole team on the ground there right now, much to their surprise. But I did have a sense, you know, when Trump was in power and the Europeans were talking essentially about having to form their own union, foreign policy union. Of course, the EU is supposed to have been their union, but has never been fully taken seriously because they couldn't get their act together often. But I wouldn't be surprised if these continuing concerns about America's stability and continuity encourage the Europeans to take more of a stand and more of a role than they have in the past. It's a bit it's a bit unstable, the image and the reality that America projects, and as I said, I think it'll take a time and it'll take effort to see whether they're really willing to play in the sandbox with others.
Great. We'll move on now to Dennis's question. Dennis, go ahead, after which there's an Israel-Palestine question in the chat, which we'll move to, or in the Q&A function. Dennis, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Ambassador, thank you very much. My question pertains more to the international stature of the United States and what President Biden and his administration can do to improve it at the moment. Trump was not the only factor in the decline of the reputation of America overseas. America has been an exporter of political radicalism for a while now. For example, Proud Boys and 3%ers established their chapters in Canada, as well as some radical left-wing movements. Can we expect the continuation of certain reputational drag that this kind of export has on the American stature abroad? And what do you think President Biden and his allies in Congress and state level governments are going to do to mitigate the impact of these unwelcome developments?
Well, I mean, I've already indicated my wariness, but I think that the Biden administration has gone out of its way to reach out. As I suggest, we'll see more of that in June. But with the climate summit, with the proposed summit for democracies that the Americans have been talking about, and with the activities of people like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Blinken, who have spoken out very strongly in favor of human rights and democracy, and not being afraid to criticize where those values have been undermined abroad. So I have some confidence that this is a different administration. I think the people behind it, there are a lot of people still to be nominated at state, but the people who are there, the people at the CIA, William Burns, you're not going to see the roguism that we saw either under Trump or under Bush 43. These are seasoned diplomats, seasoned officials that have been around, and they have a proven track record of what I would say being part of the liberal international order. So they and Biden, I think, represent the good guys in my talk, as opposed to those who would support a General Pinochet or the military regime in Argentina.
Great. So thanks for that question, Dennis. And now we'll move to the question in the Q&A from, and I may butcher your name, sorry, but Mohsen Chaudhry, who asks, with your experience in Israel, what is something you noticed differently about the country today from when you were serving as ambassador? Also, how far is a one-state solution from being likely in that region?
Well, it's a good question. Thank you, Mohsen. The situation in Israel in some ways hasn't changed much because we're still looking for the two-state solution, and in some ways it's gotten considerably worse. It's gotten considerably worse because Bibi Netanyahu has been in power for 12 years now. The country has moved to the right. The Orthodox population is increasing, and the Orthodox population, whether those that came from North Africa and Iran, Iraq, etc., or those that came from Europe, are tied to Bibi because he provides them with financial contributions and doesn't require their young people to serve in the army, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a much more right-wing group. You have a group that for many years has been stoked with fear about Iran, fear about the Palestinians not being a partner, et cetera, et cetera. So it's gotten more complicated. You've witnessed that Israel's just gone through 4 elections without really coming up with a stable government. They may be headed to a 5th, or hopefully an anti-Bibi coalition, which is trying to form itself right now, might take over. But the country is under Bibi increasingly illiberal. There are cabinet ministers who regularly attack the free press and the judiciary, and certainly attack human rights groups, verbally, I mean, of course. So, and you know, the occupation is now 54 years old, and we're not seeing on the part of the current government any steps to providing a horizon towards some kind of solution for that. So as far as a one-state solution is concerned, my take on that is that it is a non-starter. It's a non-starter for a couple of reasons. One, Israel will never allow it to happen. And I don't think the international community or the Palestinians will be able to impose it. Certainly not in your lifetime, my lifetime, or for quite a while. But secondly, a one-state solution, forcing Palestinians and Israelis who are having a difficult time for many reasons, agreeing on some fundamental issues which are solvable, but they can't agree right now, having them live together side by side is unlikely to create any stability or peace. And it's pretty clear that a one-state solution would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, for some people, that's not a problem, and they would wish to see that. But for Israel and for Jews around the world, for many reasons, stemming from pogroms in Russia to the Holocaust to anti-Semitism in Europe right now, aren't really prepared to give up the Jewish state yet. What we would all hope to see is a more liberal Jewish state, and one that makes every effort as the asymmetrically stronger power to try and find peace with its Palestinian neighbors, and to try and work out a modus vivendi that eventually leads to a Palestinian state. Not easy, but doable. You need new leadership. You need small steps of trust to begin with, but you need a pathway, and you're not going to get one under Bibi. the Palestinians themselves need new, younger, more proactive leadership as well. Hamas, different problem, could take up a whole conversation.
So based off of what you're saying, it's sounding like Benjamin Netanyahu is increasing the right wing just by his selective immigration process. So he's, I guess, creating this right wing.
Not his selective immigration process. It's the birth rate of the Orthodox. There's not that many people immigrating to Israel these days. The two fastest growing demographics in Israel are the Arab Israeli population and the Orthodox population. Although I must say the average Israeli tend to have a lot more children than we do in North America as well. But this isn't, that part's not Machiavellian, it's just the way it is. But they are moving to the right. The country has moved to the right.
Okay. Is there any sort of leverage that countries like Canada or the international community has to actually affect any sort of pressure on Israel? Like, I know, Egypt brokered some sort of ceasefire in this particular situation, but do any sort of does Israel listen to international communities? Essentially, what I'm trying to.
Good question. Good question. Well, Egypt, the United States gave credit to Egypt for solving this problem. It was very generous of them. Egypt definitely solved the Hamas side of the problem, but they didn't solve the Israeli side of the problem. 8 phone calls from Joe Biden and multiple more phone calls from other officials in the United States made it clear to Bibi Netanyahu that enough was enough. Now, it wasn't going to stop unless Hamas was prepared to stop the rockets, but so there were, so the Israelis listen to some extent to the Americans. They don't listen to the Europeans and they don't listen to us. If there were a peace process in place, we and the Europeans could definitely play a role, but getting to that peace process is really an American pressure point issue. So, but there's a recent article in the New York Times. I don't buy into it fully, but the main point of the article is basically that Israel has the 7th largest military in the world. Its military is larger than the UK's and the French combined. It has nuclear weapons. It produces its own rockets. It produces its own planes. And yes, it gets $3.8 billion a year from the Americans, but that money is money to buy American military equipment. So there is a suggestion in the article that Israel doesn't need America as much as it used to when it was a young nation, when it was the David, not the Goliath. And so does that mean the United States has less pressure points? Probably yes. But I don't think Israelis in general want to have America as an enemy. They prefer to have it as a friend. The last president that actually put serious pressure on Israel was Bush 41, the father, and Jim Baker, his Secretary of State. They put enough pressure on them to get Israel to the Madrid talks, which eventually led to some positive movement. But nobody since then has really put real pressure on. As far as Canada is concerned, the NDP has suggested that we end arms sales to Israel. We sell, I think, $13.2 million of arms related equipment to Israel. I don't think that would have much of an effect on the country in reality, but it certainly would send a signal to Canadians that the country was getting more serious about its support for a two-state solution and self-determination for the Palestinians. It wouldn't necessarily move that ball forward, but it would send a signal. Yeah, if it was done in concert with the Europeans and the Americans, it would send a strong signal. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think the tide might be turning against Israel more than it thinks. I think this last conflict somehow the dial seems to have moved, and the mood as in respect of Palestinian rights and Israel's activities, to me, I'm getting a sense seems to be changing, and not for the better for Israel.
So would Biden be catering to the liberal sensitivities of his domestic population outside of just climate change?
Well, maybe just before I answer that, maybe we should go to some other questions if there are some, and then we can come back.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I'm really glad to hear this back and forth, and it's fascinating, and they're great comments on both sides. But we do have a few more questions, and we are going a little more overtime than we had expected. But John, I think that's hopefully okay with you.
No problem.
To keep talking a little bit, and I'll just say we were initially, as part of a broader CIC Toronto and maybe CIC more broadly plan, is to have some of our events have an ending component that just has Century Circle donors, meaning those who have donated $500 or more to the CIC, as well as certain executive members with the speakers. So we will have a chance for that at the end of today's talk as well. We're trying to pilot a sort of benefit or new value to add to some of our most generous members and most active members. And that will, we'll see how long this drags on for, but that's something we might try today. But so Craig, you had your hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and ask?
Okay, thank you. I'd like
Hi,
to
Craig.
Hi, John. How you doing?
I can't see you, but I know who you are. I can see you in my mind.
Anyway, well, I can see print here. Turning back to the U.S. and just an observation that I have regarding Line 5, Enbridge Line 5. It strikes me that what Biden is doing is hoping that the courts will side with Canada, that he doesn't have to raise his hand or get involved at all. It doesn't have to upset any of his environmental followers. But it'll be interesting to see if that doesn't work, what happens then. But that raises my question. To what extent is there an opportunity for negotiation to happen behind the scenes? And I'm thinking of things, there are areas where the Canadian government is supporting the US on issues, certainly in the environmental side. And is there a chance that we can influence in our favor by offering to do things in other areas? I doubt that we could threaten to not do something or threaten to do something else, but can we trade things off in order to get something like the Enbridge Line 5, which is clearly going to be a big deal for Canada if it doesn't work out right? Thanks.
Hi. Well, I certainly agree with your first point, Craig, and I think that the feds have weighed in on that court case, and they haven't played the treaty card yet, but I think they might if they have to. Yes, I think Biden would certainly prefer if he didn't have to, and he could blame it on the courts. And to be honest, I don't know whether, but I doubt there's any conversations going on between the pipeline folks and the governor. She seemed to be quite adamant. As to trade-offs, we have generally been reluctant to trade one set of issues off against another set of issues. It can be a dangerous game. I think rather than maybe a formal trade-off, what can happen is in a conversation between the president and the prime minister, the prime minister can certainly remind the president of the 3 or 4 things that Canada is doing for the U.S. He can remind the president that he's got an election coming up, and that it would be very helpful if the president could see things our way, could weigh in perhaps privately with the governor as opposed to publicly. So there are behind the scenes soft diplomatic ways to move it ahead, but sort of an actual trade-off. We threaten not to do this unless you do this. We almost never do that with the States because they are the big boy and we're the little guy, and they can hurt us on so many fronts that getting into a tit for tat's not great. But quiet diplomacy along the lines that you're suggesting, I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening or will happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Do we have any other questions before I think we will close, except for those who among us who are Century Circle members or members of the Toronto Executive and would like to stay for some even more informal and camera on discussion with Jon. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I hate to go back to Israel, but one thing that has been concerning me tremendously, if you have Israel as a state only for Jews with a couple of token Arabs, doesn't that give the rest of the world to have no Jews or just a couple of token of Jews, which is a horrible idea. But isn't it a dangerous game they're playing? Now, there's a very good book by Michael Dann about that a two-stage solution would never work. You might be interested in reading it. It's really good.
Yeah, Michael Dann was at my house not too long ago and explaining his book to me. I disagree with it profoundly. Is it, in an ideal world, Elizabeth? Yeah, we don't particularly want to have ethnically unified countries, but if you do take a look around the world, Saudi Arabia, I would say almost all of the Gulf states, Turkey, there are many states that classify themselves as Muslim or some other ethnic nomination. So Israel exists. It exists for a lot of complicated reasons. It could be classified as the last colonial power at a time when the rest of the world was decolonizing, and it certainly has negatively affected the Palestinians. But that's a reality, and given world history, if I were an Israeli, I would stick to my guns, and I don't mean that literally, but it is probably literal, and try and maintain a Jewish majority there somehow, but while giving equal rights to Palestinian Israelis and while working very hard for a two-state solution. As I said before, I think a one-state solution is an absolute non-starter. And a confederation might have a possibility depending on how it was structured. But one thing that we forget, because we've had 12 years of Bibi, and because Israel went from being a David at the time of partition to a Goliath, which it is now. But people tend to forget what has sort of happened to the Israeli psyche. At partition, Israel was prepared to accept partition, which would have given the Arab living in the country almost 50% of the territory. Israel then fought 3 wars against not the Palestinians, because there was no Palestinian authority there, but they then fought 3 wars in which the Arabs attacked Israel, 56, 67, 73. They've subsequently fought wars with Lebanon. There have been 4 Gaza conflicts, not started by Israel. There may be, you can say there's justification, but, and there was an intifada. So Israel has some good reason to be fearful of what may come, what has come. Now, my hope is that that fear doesn't preclude them from finding a solution for the Palestinians, who have also suffered since 1948 and to some extent before, and who are suffering every day in the West Bank and in Gaza. So I'm not minimizing what's going on, but it is, I think you can't also minimize what the state of Israel means to the people living there and to the Jews in the diaspora, who frankly don't feel particularly, particularly comfortable without having that insurance policy. Many of them, like my wife, who's the child of Holocaust survivors, are a little bit too close to the Holocaust. The irony, of course, is that the Holocaust had nothing to do with Arabs, and the Arabs shouldn't be paying the price for it, because the Holocaust was created by Europeans. But people are still far too close to that to say, oh, well, we can just give up the Jewish state and our Arab brethren, and we will live together in peace. It's not going to happen, as I said, in your lifetime or mine, even though there are a lot of people that think it should.
But isn't it mostly the evangelicals in the States that really want Israel? And a lot of Jewish people nowadays really, I mean, there's probably some exceptions, but they really see the, not as necessary anymore, but it's evangelicals that really want Israel for their own reasons.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that the evangelicals, for their own reasons, support Israel, but I can assure you that the vast majority of Jews around the world, they may not support Israel's policies right now. They may not support Bibi Netanyahu, but they support the state of Israel. They just want it to be the state of Israel that they grew up with, or they thought they grew up with, or that they want. But if your suggestion that most Jews don't support Israel is not proven by the facts. They may not support Israel right now, but they want it to exist.
Thanks so much for all the questions. I think so, because as we've gone a little over time, our numbers have sort of fallen a bit, and I think even many of our executive and some of our very generous circle or Century Circle members have logged off as well, though some are still among us. But what I propose is that if there's still interest, feel free to ask another question or two. And to end me, this is me speaking to anyone in the audience. I will reiterate that we're happy to, or we are leaning toward having exclusive access to some of our generous Century Circle donors from across the CIC. But I think this is a great, it's been kind of concluding for a little bit, but I don't know, Craig, you still have your hand up, or if anyone would like to ask who's still remaining on the call. I think at least, John, it's my understanding you're comfortable going for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Sure, absolutely.
Great. And yeah, I mean, so this event is a slightly smaller one, and it's always a mixed bag with Zoom and these virtual events. But it has some benefits too in terms of having some more intimate discussion.
Absolutely.
Is there anyone who would like to speak? I think because of our numbers at the moment, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. Go ahead. And hearing none, I will conclude that that I think we're all good, unless Jon, you want to say anything to the last few stragglers here. But thanks so much, at least from my end. We'll be in touch soon. I will end the recording. And thanks to